Hey everybody, this is Leaf. Thank you for joining me at Adaptable Wealth, where we are fighting back against the bastardization of the concept of wealth and redefining it as a sound, prosperous, and healthy state. As I'm sure you're aware, the CPI hit 6.8% in November, the fastest rate in 40 years. Although this sounds like an insane rate of inflation, 6.8% is actually an understatement of the true rate of increase in the cost of living over the last year. Now, the first reason why the CPI understates the true rate of inflation is the fact that it excludes financial assets. The reason the BLS gives for excluding financial assets is that they are related to savings and not day-to-day consumption expenses. Now, I concede the fact that the financial assets cannot be consumed in the general sense, such as they don't have a useful life, you can't eat or drink them, but I disagree with this exclusion on this basis for four reasons. The first one is that transacting in financial assets absolutely is a consumable service. I go to my broker or somebody else that can help me make a financial transaction, and I pay them to perform a service for me. It's no different than going to the grocery store and paying for groceries or going to a gas station and paying them to purchase gas. Second, they are daily, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, and annual expenses for the average consumer. Retail investors are becoming a larger proportion of the financial transaction volume over the last few years, and you have employees contributing to their 401ks and their IRAs when they get paid on a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, and annual basis. The third reason I think financial assets should be included in the CPI is the fact that they are a meaningful expense for the average consumer. If you look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis personal savings rate, you'll see over the last 20 years it hovers in between the 5 and 8% range. Now, if you compare that to the weightings of the CPI, you'll see that it slots in right around medical services and just above recreation, education, and communications, which include stuff like phones, postage, software, etc. So you can see it's a top 4 or 5 expense for the average consumer. The fourth reason I think financial assets should be included in the CPI is the fact that the average American owns financial assets. According to a Gallup poll in 2021, 56% of Americans reported owning stock in some shape or form. Now, this doesn't include bonds, it doesn't include insurance, it doesn't include checking and savings accounts, it doesn't include other financial products. If we were to add all those in there, the percentage would skyrocket. And for those 4 reasons, I think we should be including financial assets in our inflation metrics. The most common rebuttal that I'll hear is the fact that we want financial asset inflation because we benefit from it. And to an extent, I do agree. If asset prices are increasing based off of strong economic fundamentals such as strong business investment, spending, and balance sheet, strong consumer spending, savings, and balance sheet, minimal debt, and minimal intervention from the government and Federal Reserve, then I agree. We want that asset inflation and we benefit from that. However, this has become more the exception than the rule. Our economy has become more dependent on debt-fueled growth, whether it's by the corporations, the households, government, or the Federal Reserve. There's significant empirical evidence showing that once you reach a certain percentage of debt to GDP, that further acquisition of debt only creates more instability and fragility in the economy. Eventually, the bubble's going to pop, and you're going to see asset prices get cut by 30, 40, 50%. Consumers cut back on their spending, which brings down business investment and profits. They start laying people off, and you get a vicious cycle going back and forth. Now you have millions of people who just watched their savings get cut by 30, 40, 50%, and they don't have a job. So now they're forced to draw on those reduced assets in order to make up for the difference between their cost of living and what they will receive in unemployment benefits. And you make the argument now that all asset price inflation is created equal and that no matter what, we want asset price inflation. I do not think so. And for these reasons, I think there should be some consideration paid to financial assets in an inflation metric. The second reason the CPI understates the true rate of inflation is the fact that it excludes housing prices. Up until the 80s, house prices were the basis for the CPI housing cost index. However, the BLS made the argument that depending on the buyer's intent, you can consider housing both a consumption good and an investment good, which makes sense. However, the proposed replacement is ridiculous. They came up with a concept of owner equivalent rent, which is basically the rent that an owner would have to pay to rent his or her own house. In other words, they take a owner-occupied property and look at it from an investment point of view, which is the exact opposite of their stated objective. Even worse, the way that they determine the appropriate price to use for a property is to ask the owner how much they would be able to rent their price for, unfurnished and without utilities, if they were to put their house on the market to rent. What we end up with are potentially biased estimates for the single largest component of the CPI. Comically, the BLS could easily determine the house prices for the owner-occupied segment because they have to do so in their calculations for the owner equivalent rent. So what's the impact of all of this? If you look at the trend of the Case-Shiller Home Price Index or the All Transaction Home Price Index versus the owner equivalent rent, you're going to see that the Home Price Index is increased at approximately 4.3% compound annual growth rate over the past 34 years versus 3.1% for the owner equivalent rent. Now, this may not seem like much on the surface, but if you compound that over a 34-year period, that puts the home price index as 139% higher than the owner equivalent rent component of the CPI. Now, one of the most glaring problems with the CPI is apparent. Had we been including house prices this entire time, the official measurement of the CPI would have consistently been higher than it was. The next question is, should house prices be part of a consumption-focused index? And my response is absolutely. We include rental prices in the CPI, and buying a house is as much a consumption of housing as renting a house is, so why would we exclude owner-occupied housing? The third reason the CPI understates the true rate of inflation is the use of quality adjustments. Product characteristics, quality, capability, and availability will change over time. Companies will discontinue old products, introduce new products, and these new products usually have a higher price. The BLS had to find a way to estimate the price of the new product, assuming it existed before, so they can get a price change, which is the whole point of the CPI. To do this, they break the new product into its various features. Then they go into the market to find products that currently do not have these features and products that do have these features so that they can get an estimate of the price increase due to these features. Once they have these estimates, they add those estimates back to the old product, so now they get an estimate of the new product had it existed before. This raises the price of the old product relative to the new product so that the percentage change is much smaller. I know this sounds complicated, it really isn't. Let's take a look at an example on the BLS's own website. Here you have two products, item A and item B. Item A is $250 with a 27-inch screen. It's a CRT ED TV, whereas the new product, item B, is $1,250, but because it has a 42-inch plasma HD TV. Now, we can't just calculate the percentage change between these two because of the higher quality of item B. It would be an apples to oranges comparison. So, what the BLS does is they come up with these point estimates for each of the different features of the new product. Once they have the estimates, they add it back to the old product, so now you get an apples-to-apples comparison. As you can see here now that both item A and item B have the same features, 42-inch plasma HD TV. The difference, as you'll notice, is that the price of item A went from $250 to $1,345. The price of item B stays the same because it is the current product in the market and that is the current market price. The out-of-pocket cost to purchase this TV went from $250 up to $1,250, which is a 400% increase. However, Houdini over there at the BLS manipulated the price of the old product up $250 to $1,345. Now, instead of having a 400% price increase, we have a 7% price decrease. Yes, you heard me correctly. We went from a 400% price increase, an actual out-of-pocket cost increase, to a 7% decrease with these quality adjustments. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is complete nonsense. How did they get away with this? But this is just an example on their website. The true impacts due to these quality adjustments are much smaller than this. So let's take a look at a few real-world examples. The first example we have here is with new car prices. What you're looking at here is the average new vehicle transaction price as measured by Edmunds.com from 2002 to 2019. You can see that it went from about $26,000 in 2002 to $37,000 in 2019. That's a 45% increase. Over the same period, from 2002 to 2019, the CPI new vehicle index went up only 4.9%. The logical consumer would say, okay, well, if that's the case, I'll just go ahead and purchase used vehicles. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. It went from about $18,000 in 2014 to about $21,000 in 2019. That is a 16% increase. The CPI used car and truck index actually went down by 3.3%. So although the impact of these quality adjustments are much lower than the 400% increase to 7% decrease example that the BLS has on their websites, you can see that the quality adjustments do reduce the impact of price inflation pretty darn significantly. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, I'll just stick with the base models, and this is an option. However, as time goes on and the technology gets better and better, these new features become standard in the base models. And so even though you're sticking with the minimal feature models, you're still going to pay higher and higher and higher prices because the new features come standard in the base model. Herein lies the problem with quality adjustments. They ignore the fact that consumer out-of-pocket costs are increasing, and instead they report them as a much smaller increase or even an outright decrease. Now, don't get me wrong, there have been significant improvements in terms of the safety features, ride quality, gas mileage, and entertainment features over the 2002 to 2019 period. However, if I was to give you the option to purchase a brand new 2002 model for $26,000 or a brand new 2019 model for $37,000, which one would you choose? Honestly, which one would you choose? Please leave a comment down below. I'm interested to hear what you all think about this. Most unbiased, logical people will agree that there is a place for quality adjustments in an inflation measurement. Whether you agree or disagree with the extent or the methods that are employed by the BLS is another story. The fourth reason the CPI understates the true increase in the cost of living is the allowance of substitution within goods and services versus a fixed basket weighting system. Just like with housing prices, originally the CPI employed a fixed basket weighting system. But in 1999, the BLS recognized the fact that technology was becoming a more and more prevalent factor in goods and services, that they decided to allow for substitution to account for the changes in consumer spending patterns and preferences. Substitution occurs when consumers will change the goods and services that they are buying due mainly to an increase in the price or a reduction in quality. The fixed basket weighting system is the correct way to track the cost of living changes over time. You set the weightings based off of current consumer spending patterns and preferences, and you track that over time until consumer preferences and spending patterns change enough that the old weightings don't make sense. At that point, you update the weightings to the new consumer spending patterns, and then you track that going forward. Now, it's important to note that in order for the index to not lose all of its meaning, you have to restate the historical index measurements based off of the updated weightings. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to compare the cost of living from earlier to the current period. Now, my problem with the allowance of substitution in the CPI is not the fact that they allow for substitution. Consumer preferences change over time. I think anybody with a brain will realize that we can't just set weightings at a certain period and keep those weightings forever. However, the CPI recognizes any substitution to a lower quality good, which almost always comes with a lower price. They recognize that as a reduction in the cost of living. And the CPI does not make any type of quality adjustments to account for that reduction in quality. And final reason the CPI understates the true rate of inflation is this fixation on the core inflation rate, which is the rate excluding food and energy. The logic is that these are the two most volatile components, and the Fed wants to focus on the true underlying rate of the CPI. Now, I completely understand the exclusion of energy, as it is by far the most volatile component. Swings of 30–40% will definitely skew the underlying trend. But the exclusion of food is complete nonsense. First, you can't just exclude 14% of your population without introducing some sort of bias. And second, there are components left in the core index that contribute the same amount of variability to the aggregate index as food does. Take used cars and trucks, for example. Although its weight is much less than that of food, its volatility is 5 times higher, which is enough to have a similar effect on the total volatility of the CPI. While we're at it, why don't we just remove durable goods, which is another highly volatile component? Despite these facts, this is one of the least egregious manipulations of the CPI, mainly because the cost of living adjustments are based off of the aggregate index and not the core rate. However, it's yet another example of the government doing whatever it can to try to minimize and reduce inflation measurements. The last thing I want to leave you with is not something that the BLS does, rather it's how common people usually misinterpret and misuse inflation measurements such as the CPI. The CPI is meant to measure the average price change for the average consumer. The problem is there's no such thing as the average consumer. Most people spend their income at different percentages than the weightings used in the CPI. Even the BLS admits on its own website that the CPI seldom mirrors a particular consumer's experience. The reason is that every good and every service has its own inflation rates. And because of this, every individual, every household, every business, and every government has their own personal inflation rate based off of the goods and services that they buy. There are 3 primary components that affect each person's inflation rate. The first is the rate of price increases. At what rate are the prices of the goods and services that you buy increasing? Second are your weightings or your mix. What percentage of your income are you spending on each item? And third, location. Where you live can have an impact on the rate of price increases that you experience. So now we all understand how the CPI is manipulated and that the true increase in the cost of living is much higher than what official measurements suggest. But the most important question is what we can do to protect our income and our savings from the theft of inflation. That's the topic of my next video, so please subscribe, hit that bell icon so you're notified when the video comes out. In the meantime, you can check out all 30 actionable steps over at my website, adaptablewealth.com. I've already written the article, I just haven't made the video yet. The URL is up on the screen, and until then, you all take care, and remember that wealth is not only about money. Your time and health is just as important, and working to improve all 3 pillars of wealth is key to being adaptable, resilient, and thriving in life.